Hello. So the plan is for me to do this witchcraft live about weather magic, as we've been, well, Liam's been berating me about it for weeks. So kind of hoping that we can go through that. We attempted to kind of start it on Wednesday when we had some problems with Fausti, but Fausti then went ahead, so it's all good. So today I'm going to try and talk about weather magic. So kind of give you some ideas about how to make that happen, and kind of establishing that connection. So what I'll kind of do first is kind of talk a little bit about weather magic in general. So obviously it's about manipulating what's already in existence as opposed to manifestation. So most of your spell work that you are used to doing is manifestation work. So you are creating something almost out of nothing, or trying to bring things in or out. But normally it's manifestation when you're trying to find your yellow ball, or those sorts of things is what we would call manifestation. So with weather magic doesn't work on that kind of principle. Weather magic is an existing system that you are manipulating. And this is why you have to kind of approach it from a slightly different angle, because obviously you're working with what is essentially an ecosystem. And I don't mean that from a scientific point of view of it being the cause and effect, etc. Is the fact that actually you are working with a system that has its own set of rules, and getting to know and work with the set of rules that exists within weather magic. So one of the first things I will always advise people to do is learn a bit more about weather. So with other types of magic, you don't really necessarily need to understand the principle. It just helps. Whereas actually you'll get much better results faster, particularly with something like weather magic, because like I said, it has its own set of rules. Meteorology is not just just a word we throw around. It is a system of its own. So you need to kind of get a feel for what effects happen with what. I'm not saying that you need to become a meteorologist and know everything there is to know about them, but our storm chaser friends in the US will probably have much better knowledge of tornadoes, and therefore able to create them quicker, and hurricane systems, etc., because they're used to seeing how they build. So if you live in an area that is not used to having snow, for example, you're probably not used to what happens with that build up. So how are you supposed to gauge how it's working and measure the level of success if you're not used to that particular weather system? So what you're not wanting to do is necessarily play with weather, in the sense that causing a type of weather that doesn't happen in your area at all. What you're trying to do is remember that with working with weather systems is you are manipulating. So bringing the rain, because it's a drought season or something like that, remember that you are moving a weather system from somewhere else, or you are actually making changes in the atmosphere that allows it to find the rhythm that it's supposed to find in order to make that happen. So I'm hoping this is making sense. I'm sure Liam will jump in and shout at me if I'm not making any sense at all. But it is about manipulation, which is why it requires a very different approach. So when you have done a set of movements or cast a certain spell, you are not going to necessarily see something happen instantaneously. You're going to see something build. And with weather, you're going to quite easily see it move. This isn't like when you're manifesting something like a yellow ball, where it's a case of you are imagining what is going to happen and it's going to happen. You are trying to line yourself up with the rhythm that is within that existing system. and how you can increase or decrease the rhythm in order to get a certain kind of effect. So I've been working with weather for a ridiculous amount of time. It's one of the first things I did as a kind of a new witch in this life, is working with the weather. And I have a natural affinity with it that comes from previous lifetimes that I don't expect you to necessarily understand. But is that one of those people that has, particularly because it's the UK, and we have such a bizarre arrangements of weather, because we're small ecosystems within small ecosystems. It's a really bizarre little island that has all sorts of climates all within one space that is ridiculously small. So when you're dealing with kind of microclimates, it's an interesting place to kind of go from one end of the island to the other end of the island. If you were to go in a day, you'd probably see every kind of weather pattern that is available across that day. Obviously not the extremes, but it is a case of seeing them all the time. So there is that kind of natural affinity that people in that particular regions, whereas say if you're in Texas or somewhere else in the kind of tornado and hurricane corridor that is that part of the states, you'll probably have a natural affinity to what weather you are used to seeing. If you're up in Alaska and you snow all the time, you're going to know all 50 shades of snow. So knowing that, and obviously seeing snow from the absolute extreme point, so they're going to be kind of your kind of natural knowledge and natural understanding of what these systems do. So for me, I work with it in a kind of very intuitive way, like we do with a lot of the different kinds of magics that we do and teach through here, and obviously the Thoth TV and the Patreon, etc. So for me, it was kind of getting to know that it has a life of its own, and obviously understanding that it's not a manifestation, that it's a manipulation. So there are two main ways I find of working with weather, and the first of those two is kind of just going from a completely spirit-based kind of evocation way of working. So you can make friends essentially, or make subjects of the spirits that are included in those ecosystems. So wind spirits and water spirits, etc., those kind of elements that kind of manipulate as part of their day-to-day, that they are in keeping with that understanding. So if you approach it from that point of view, it's essentially almost petition work and evocation. So with those kind of works, you're asking. Obviously, I just suddenly thought, obviously this is live, so if you want to ask questions and I will direct and then come back, it's fine. So just throw questions on if you like. Do witches do weather magic? Was this more of a classical witch thing? I still do weather magic, but then I don't know if we count classical witch being someone practicing over 1,000 years. Okay, funny. Well done, Liam. So Liam's moderating, as you can see. That's why you don't see his face. And we'll keep it that way. The maybe end, we'll let him come back on. So yes, there is a big part of it being a kind of classical or ancient way. You look at any story about witches, and you will find that kind of weather magic going on. So conjuring storms, calling winds, all those sorts of parts are all part of this kind of mythology that surrounds the witch. I don't know how many people actually practice weather magic these days, and I think the main reason for that is most of them in this kind of post, I'm not saying post Kelden, but the post kind of new age, kind of consider that's a place you shouldn't be messing with. So I think most people can appreciate that that is an ecosystem, on the basis that it kind of like, oh well, I shouldn't mess with that. If I pull rains from there, then there's going to be a drought over there. And yes, when you're first learning how to do it, there is the potential of making those things happen. In my early days, I definitely knocked a few helicopters out of the sky, etc., by accident. But the you know, those sorts of things are things that you kind of deal with. So yeah, and obviously Eldris just put a piece on Liam. The yeah, I think in particular cultures in the world where the magic is still a big part, and I may have froze. Can you see me? That's fine. So yeah, I think there are parts of the world there where it is still very much alive. Rain dances and things like that are still practiced in certain cultures. I think in what Liam was trying to say is, I suppose, in the Western world, particularly Europe, etc., probably doesn't happen as much as it once did, because it's a survival thing. Weather magic is one of these lists of things that is to do with survivalist magic. And in the modern world, we don't have a massive need for those things because, you know, if you can't get your peppers locally, you'll buy them from a different supermarket that's pulled them from another part of the world that did have rain that season. So you're not reliant on having that to happen in order for you to survive, and therefore it's more an interest or a specialism these days, I guess, rather than it being one of these things that all practitioners do. But yeah, so going back to the two kind of strands, like the first one for me would be kind of invocation. So would be this kind of, like the rain dance, is about calling in, is about bringing in something that is existing over somewhere else and calling it into a space. So whether or not that's you interacting with the weather spirits themselves of that particular storm in order to bring it over this way, or if you're just calling upon it. So, you know, it is a case of actually calling the winds. So if you were a navigator trying to get over the Atlantic, you'd want strong winds in order to make sure you can get there. You know, witches would have potentially have been involved in pulling those winds. If you were having a particular dry patch, particularly in the Mediterranean, it was something that was done with all sorts of summoning. Those would obviously be the gods themselves. They would be petitioning to make that happen. You even got in the ancient Egyptian world, priestesses would have braids and beads in their hair that they would manipulate in order to make changes in weather patterns. But the to kind of move into kind of more modern ways of working is breaking that down. Obviously, it would be bizarre for you to kind of sit or jump around in your garden these days, you know, doing a rain dance, and whether or not people still do, you know, with the exception of people who have been trained in that way, like Eldrith over there, it's not something you're probably going to see a massive amount of. My personal way of working is going down that kind of route, not of petition work, but of manipulating energy. So understanding and using your kind of energetic vision in order, your kind of ways of psychically seeing how energy is manipulating around and giving things a push, or slowing things down in order to allow that to happen. So as part of that is understanding and feeling. You know, when you walk into a room, you are able to sense the energy that's in that space. So it's a case of then going and you know, manipulating that, cooling the room or heating it up. So you're used to doing these things already. There are things that we naturally do as human beings as we interact with each other. So all you've got to do is translate that into a way that works for you on a greater, when you're looking at a greater system. So I will often get people who I am mentoring to start with kind of going down the traditional method of calling spirits. So for that, I tend to do that with kind of music and dance. So I personally work with you know, like to work with music. I'm not the sort of person that would probably go and do a rain dance in the garden, but the you learn the kind of rhythm that works with it. So I use the the manipulation point for that is emotion. So the focus would be on using emotion. So when you are calling upon or a sense of need, is still tapping into that traditional way of survivalist magic. So actually figuring what you need with an emotional trigger allows that to kind of connect the two. So what I would ask you normally to do, or, you know, ask somebody to do, would be to get to know these different kind of weather systems. I mean, very, very basic research. You're kind of going, okay, could you write down on a list of what you would consider to be weather systems? So, you know, rain, hailstorm, you know, thunder, lightning, etc., and kind of break them down into kind of going, okay, what happens around in the sky in that feeling? How do you see that manipulation happen when they're coming? So, you know, how do you feel that build, or that you know, that mugginess that often comes before a lightning storm, or and that kind of lightning storm then breaks on that build of energy. So when you start to kind of think about it more in a case, what is your understanding of how weather happens, different weathers happen, and then assigning what you consider to work with. So like I say, for me, I use music. You could use dance or whatever you want to use, but for me, music's that kind of trigger for me, and is a great way of moving up and down emotional fields. You all know how different kinds of music makes you feel, so kind of matching the two up allows you to kind of play with that intersection between what emotion and the weather actually do, and how they can kind of connect to each other. So have a think about those sorts of things. So if you were to gonna go at something like the wind and breaking that down into, you know, a small breeze, you know, the start of a gale, then a really windy day, like a full-on, you know, pre-storm, and then going to kind of what would tornado, if you've ever experienced one, feels like, and then hurricane, and step up along one kind of stream, and then start to play with how that builds and how that kind of reaches climax, etc., and attach that to an emotional standpoint and a music, and a way of reading music. So it might be that you a little breeze might be something playful, then starting to build up as it starts to form a gale. Maybe the energy rises, so in that point might be that you like music that's got a bigger beat, a faster beat, or it might be that it's louder music that makes that happen, like something that builds in volume. Whatever works for you, but essentially you start with those processes. So you know, allowing that emotion that comes with music allows you to then kind of marry the two up and kind of start to manipulate the energy that's around you. Obviously, you're not going to do a great weather magic by not being outside. So obviously, depending on the environment you're in, is going to depend on how much you can do that. At the moment, it's ridiculously hot here, which is not ridiculously hot for people that live in San Francisco or used to, or in a desert in the middle of Africa. But for me, this is hot. It's about 25 degrees and it's already starting to bug me. I've got the fan on, etc. So you need to kind of understand, and going for walks and kind of playing with that. You can set up playlists, and kind of give yourself to understand that rhythm, and play with the build. You don't want to go too big too soon, because you want to be able to understand that rhythm and that energy change, and it's working with that. I probably should answer Michelle's questions, but I just wanted to kind of finish that point as the difference between the kind of energy manipulation work compared to kind of petition based evocation. So Michelle says something about would weather magic also be included as an ingredient or factor in a spell that's not about weather? So yes, you could take you could take storm water, for example. Lots of people use things like that, or spring water, etc. Or yes, you could attach a particular kind of change to the way that the weather is moving. You will want to be careful if that's what you're doing. If you're attaching a spell to a live system, that's trickier. If you are collecting the energy of, say, with storm water, that is a ready-made battery. So, you know, collecting that kind of rainwater or anything like that works the same way as any other ingredient. So it will have an energy that works for it. And tapping into that energy through that small amount, you know, you don't need a massive vat of stormwater in order to make that happen. It's about tapping into that energy stream that allows you to do what you want it to do. So, but again, think about what the storm actually means to you. Not going to go through Scott Cunningham kind of level ingredient and correspondences, but what does that storm mean to you? So some people are terrified by storms. Other people are excited and exhilarated. You know, these storm chasers are exhilarated by the energy that is in a storm. So, you know, when you're choosing that as an ingredient in spell work, then obviously you've got to consider what does that actually mean for you. So, you know, does if you're wanting to do a love you know, some kind of love magic or something, and then you throw storm water in, make sure that the storm water is in there because you want the exhilaration and the excitement that's going, and not that you're wanting to really seriously fuck it up by throwing in a catalyst that you haven't actually thought about the consequences of. So yeah, you can use it as an ingredient in the work. What I would kind of advise against, unless you are controlling the storm itself and bringing that in yourself, that you're careful about attaching spell work to a storm or a particular weather system, because that means that if you don't have control over that weather system, that the energy is going to ebb and flow in a way that you aren't necessarily controlling. So you know, you wouldn't go and do a healing magic and use a storm to do it. Yes, if you were wanting to bottle part of that and using the water in order to be the ingredient in actually making that happen, that makes sense. If you're using the live system as it is passing through, that can be difficult. There are ways to do it. You would essentially want to have some kind of charging point that is coming directly in, as if you were using the energy directly. But if suddenly that storm goes away, you're going to need a backup battery power in order to allow that to continue. So, you know, think about the dynamic of when you're using that as weather as an ingredient. In what state is the safest way to make what you're manifesting happen? And that's the difference, is that manifestation. Obviously, going from an invocation kind of way or petition-based work, if you're working with the spirit itself of a storm, that's different. If you're petitioning them for help in order to make a spell, you haven't got to worry about the storm reaching a crescendo. It doesn't need to happen. If you're speaking of actually working with storm spirits, I keep going to storm spirits, but it's wind spirits or drought spirits or whatever you want to work with. Yes, of course, you could use the same kind of petition-based work that you would with deities or other kinds of spirits, or that you would work with altogether. Eldrith's got a comment. Everything you're saying resonates with what I know. Different areas have different spirits, so a spell/ritual may differ a bit, but the info is there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's about getting to know your weather system. Obviously, when I was working on it in my teens, it was a case of you know, trial and error, because there wasn't someone to kind of show me how it worked. and everything that you read in books made no total sense and no sense to me at all. These horrible books, these Wiccan books talking about weather magic, where they'd got long magical spells that seemed to go on a week. They were just paragraphs and paragraphs of kind of inciting. At the end of the day, you're not going to want to wait when you're wanting this. If you're wanting this sort of work to happen, you're not going to want to cast a spell and wait a week for something to happen. I will point out that even after how long I've been practicing, and I still make the occasional mistake, weather magic is something I feel really comfortable with, and I've always struggled with conjuring snow. It's mainly because I have this kind of sense of contentment that I associate with snow, and me feeling content is a hard emotion for me to ever find. However, I chose to use a different method this Christmas just gone. Obviously, we'd had a horrendous year with COVID, the really bad 2020, and I kind of wanted a white Christmas for people to kind of give them an uplift, I guess, over a Christmas where you couldn't really spend any time with family. So, in that kind of spell work, which was a spell, so it was a mixture of conjuring, a manifestation, along with energy manipulation, and obviously that involved having a bottling of the first snow of winter in order to allow me as an ingredient to use that later. So obviously I'd done the conjuring in order to bring the snow here. I then bottled the first snow that came in order to keep that as a ready-made spell for the future works. And then in the new year, I thought, oh, well, it's bottled water, so surely I just need to freeze it again to give it a go. And I made the mistake of forgetting the basic laws of physics, which is that when water freezes, it expands. And when it's in a glass bottle, it's going to force an explosion. Anyway, it was an interesting result, but just remember how your ingredients work, and it doesn't matter how long you're practicing. Sometimes us super witches take for granted something that is ridiculously obvious. Okay, next one. Mikhail, any thunderstorm puts me in the mood, into a right state for sorcery. Can those spirits help me to achieve the goal, to hit the target? Yes, they can, but again, it works in the same way that working with any spirit is actually going, how well do you trust them? How good are they at reaching that particular goal? What are you wanting them to achieve? So, if you're going, and it's about appropriate spell choice and, using the right person to help you make that happen. Obviously, I'm using person very loosely with different kinds of spirits. You're not going to go to necessarily a wind spirit to necessarily kill somebody off. The reason you wouldn't do that is because yet in times gone by, a wind spirit probably could go and do that for you, because we still traveled by boat a lot, and a storm or something like that could destroy a journey and everybody on board. Obviously, or if your intended target is flying somewhere, then yes, I suppose you could petition a wind spirit. But you've got to then be aware of the collateral damage of taking out an entire Boeing 747 and everybody on it. So you've got to consider about how they are willing to help, because at the end of the day, they'll have energy. If you're just wanting the energy, then it might be that you ask that spirit to conjure a storm for you, to then bottle and use as an ingredient as a charging point. So, consider about it. Whereas actually, would it be more appropriate, if you're trying to off somebody, to go and speak to a Saturnine spirit whose job it is to restrict and end things? So, consider whether or not the choice of the spirit you're going to is the right one for the spell work that's happening. But remember that whenever it comes down to spirit work, your relationship with that spirit is the bit that matters. As to what you're going to achieve will depend entirely on your relationship with them. So it really depends on what's going on. I don't know if Liam's still here because he's not been clicking buttons and stuff, and I can't do it from this side. I don't know if he's listening still. So if he's got any weird questions or things that he feels I've missed, we'll kind of I'll keep going for a little bit, talking about different kinds of weather, etc., and different kind of methods. But spirit troubles. It really depends on when you're using it from a spirit point of view that you consider your relationship is basically the bit that would be the most important. Why would a spirit that you have nothing to do with any other time help you with doing a big work for no reason? So, you know, consider what your payment will be, how you're paying for it. So Elder Son, spirit entity / entities also teach us, I think is what you mean. If it knows that about you, it may cause it to order to say do it. Yeah. So, you know, it depending on how you work with those spirits and how well you know them, it will really depend on how you want how that relationship works that allows you to do those things. You know, there are things that you can learn from those spirits that you wouldn't. Oh, okay. Liam's okay. Now I mean what. Now I know what Liam's meaning. So he's having some spirit trouble in the space where he's working in studio, I guess. So once he's moved them on, I don't know what it'll be his own fault. I imagine he's gone and done something, or he's gotten on out working with a student again, and has probably attracted something else that he shouldn't have attracted. But yeah, going back to what Eldred is saying, yes, you could go and petition a spirit and work with a spirit in order to know more about weather and how to work with it, and you'd learn new ways of doing it. Obviously, this is just the way that I have worked with it. I'm not saying it's the only way that you can. I just find that this an emotional connection because it works best, because at the end of the day, weather makes people feel. Maybe that's because I'm British, that it's one of those things that, because you know it's a cultural a thing that we literally all constantly complain about the weather. It's either too hot or it's too cold or it's too windy or it's too wet, and we are known for making those kind of comments. And maybe it is just that there is a connection that we have with this constantly changing weather that we have here that's never quite right. That means that we have such an emotional connection to those types of weather. Maybe if you're in a place in the world where literally all it does is snow all the time, you may have a different a different way of working with it. I'm sure Eskimos have, and that might be the wrong way to, I don't know what we're allowed to say now. It was Eskimo, then it wasn't right, and you had to say Inuit, and then that only works to one particular kind of tribe. Anyway, I'm not going to go down there, but essentially if you're in an area where the snow is, I imagine you have multiple words for the same kind of weather, because it's something you see all the time. So you see a smaller change in that particular kind of weather. For us, it either snows or it doesn't. There is no you know, we'll get it cold and it just be too cold to snow all the time and never actually getting it. So there's an excitement that forces a childlike response that we get when snow finally happens here, because it's so rare. At the same time, got people constantly complaining about it because we're not prepared for snow because it's so rare. So a little tiny inch of snow seems to close the entire country down for a whole day. So, you know, there is that kind of understanding of what the cultural connections and the day-to-day impact that different kind of weathers has on your work. So and a kind of better understanding that relationship between you and those weathers will allow you to have a relationship with it, allow you to manipulate it. But it comes down to this: conjuration is not manifestation. So, you know, calling something in is a different kind of magic to manifesting. So with manifestation, it is a case of creating a situation in which something can happen. It's a different kind of magic than calling something forth. So when you're calling something forth, it has its own existence and you are bringing it further over to you. Whether or not that made any sense at all, but it made sense to me. So hopefully that did. Are there any more questions while Liam is still sorting his crap out? And hopefully Liam will jump in a minute. I know there are several people that were particularly interested in weather magic, and whether or not they are actually around in order to see this one, I don't know. But it'll give you, there is an opportunity for you to ask further questions. But I'm hoping explaining it in the way that I've explained it will allow you to understand weather a little bit better, or maybe it's confused you even more. I don't know. I'm not as great as Liam is at breaking things down into a step-by-step process like that he does, but I'm happy to kind of workshop your way through with you. So by all means, if you don't catch this while it's live, it'll stay on Witchcraft Live. So Witchcraft Live, then obviously you can continue to comment afterwards. Mikhail, yes, this video recorded. It's like all the ones that we have on Witchcraft Live. All the ones on Witchcraft Live, there is a bit of an archive on there. So if you're watching it on YouTube, then go over to their Facebook group and there's a complete archive there, and this will stay up on the YouTube. So it will be there for you to keep referring back to, and then realize I've said something completely bizarre and you want me to explain what I mean. Right, Liam says, do you tie types of weathers to emotions, or is that an accident? It's an understanding. I suppose, and I'll use that phrase again that I hate. I suppose it's a bit of a shadow work thing of understanding the trigger points that you have. So my reaction to types of weather in my youth has tied to particular weather systems. So either now consciously, which is the part you have to remember when doing weather magic, because it is a relationship that you are having with certain energies. And I don't mean necessarily deities or spirits, but that too is having that understanding of how that works. I'm conscious that when I go up somewhere high, where I have a fear of heights, I know my energy starts to change, and that fear reaction can start to affect the weather. So I have to be aware of that. Connection is, for me, permanent. I could spend a lot of time unhinging myself from it, but I really don't want to. So I learn to kind of control my emotions in order to allow that manipulation to work properly. But yes, using it in the way that I am describing has the potential knock-on effect of binding you to weather systems, depending on how you work with them. But how I personally work goes on another level in order to actually tie myself to those kind of energies. Michelle says, how did you get started at the beginning with working with weather? Okay, so for me it was I read some really crap books, and they were probably Scott Cunningham's and things like that, those sorts of writers, from the technically after he was dead, in the kind of books that were printed in the 70s and books that were printed in the 80s, reprinted in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that I received in the 90s, was reading them and kind of going, this doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you have a 3-page invocation in order to bring a little bit of rain? And started to work with that arrangement. So it was kind of like breaking that down and understanding different weathers and how they made me feel and connecting the two. So for me, it was a really organic process but that I have an unfair advantage of being able to access previous lives where I would have done this. So, but essentially it was that, and then it was an extended process of understanding how the weather made me feel, and then how could I make myself feel that emotion in order to trigger the effect. So, starting as a small energy field of kind of, like I said, the wind moving around you, which is something that works on such a small, a minute scale, that allowed you to kind of move energy around you. The same way you do when you do yoga or Pilates. Again, movement is a way that you can do it. Dance is a way that you can lock into these things. But for me, it was triggering the emotion through music. So, it starts with knowing that a song makes me feel a certain way. And then before long, it was a case of you could, whenever I thought of that particular song, the emotion would then come, and then for the weather would come with it. So it then starts to go, well, actually, you no longer need to play the music in order to do it. It's a case of going through your kind of Rolodex of emotions through song. It might be that actually you're just originally you're having to hum along in order to harmonize yourself with that song or that piece of music. Later becomes a part of all you need to think about is the beat. The words might not be necessary anymore, but actually that is enough of a trigger for you to find that emotion, and that emotion allows you to raise that kind of energy and manipulate that kind of energy. And it's that kind of part of breaking it down to the point that you get to the point where you don't even need to think about it anymore. The same way it does with manifestation magic. The less you have to think about it, the more that you might not need to actually the less you even have to think about it to make things happen, is because you're getting to that point where the unconscious part is triggering. And the reason I like to use music and dance is because of that emotional connection happens there in the subconscious, is not a conscious fit. The control over it is not something you can easily do consciously. It takes more work, whereas that trigger, if it's one that is triggered in your subconscious, allows that to happen partway through. The first stage, you're further through the process of manifestation and conjuring happens in that kind of switch from the conscious to the subconscious. So if you're already there and you've skipped the conscious part and gone straight to the subconscious part, it makes you more effective at spell casting. I don't know if that made any sense to you, Michelle. Please tell me if it didn't and what bit you want me to expand on, but I will. Eldest says, some people are more intuitive to weather, while some need to do a 3-page step-by-step to interpret what they're working. Yeah, I suppose that's fair. I just don't find any kind of 3-page invocation is ever going to work for anybody in a sense, because when you're working so hard on recalling a whole piece of writing like that isn't your words, you wouldn't then wonder why that spell doesn't work particularly well for you, is because one, they're not your words, and two, that whoever was trying to had their own understanding of how that works. So what is better is, and which is why I use music, is that song and its lyrics are already part of you. Because it's a piece of music you love or you hate, you already have an assigned emotion to it, and therefore the words don't matter, but the words might be part of why you love that song or hate that song. But it allows you to have that relationship you already have on a subconscious level, means you're already a step ahead of somebody else's words. So it's a case of you read these long, you're spending so much time learning the words or focusing on somebody else's words, that the manifestation part or the manipulation part isn't the bit you're focusing on. So that's why I kind of don't like those kind of spells, and why I don't encourage people to use them. If you can get a gut reaction trigger, you are going to get a much better result than going through, you know, a conditioning, which is essentially what that is, a conditioning in order to make that happen. Michelle says, Scott Cunningham was exhausting to me. He was almost discouraging. Yeah, I totally agree, but mainly because I don't think he fully understands the magic that he was actually talking about. Is a large part of it, is that he's not actually understanding how these things work on a grander scale. And therefore, when trying to explain it to somebody else, which is tricky, you know, I will give any person that writes witchcraft books you know, some credit. Liam will shout at me, I'll probably pop up in a second. But, you know, because actually magic is so personal, witchcraft is so personal, that it is really hard, except on a one-to-one basis, which is why we use the mentoring method, and why it's such a traditional method of of teaching witchcraft, is because it is so personal. How you connect to these energies is entirely subjective to you as a person. So actually better understanding the way music and weather and other environmental features make you feel allows you to have a better understanding of you as a person, but also how you can raise energy from that and make use of that understanding that you have of yourself. I'm probably starting to sound like one of these insta witches by now, but Liam will hopefully jump in and make any last comments before I go. Is there any further questions before I kind of wrap this up? Because I could talk for hours about it and go through individual experiences, but I don't think that would necessarily get you anywhere. If you've got experiences of weather magic yourself that you want to share with us on Witchcraft Live or on the YouTube or whatever, then at least then I can respond to those on an individual basis. But it is understanding that it is a different kind of magic. I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. It's a different kind of magic than you're used to working. This is about manipulation. It's about energy change, not manifestation, which is what most traditional spell work is about. These aren't one-off spells that make something happen. This is a building of a relationship with energy. And if you want it to be about spirit communication, then that's different. Oh, here we go. Liam has jumped in. Weather magic, what's the worst that can happen? It really depends on what you're able to manipulate. I've had instances where I've lost my temper, and a lightning storm has chased a friend home and almost killed them. So, you know, it really depends on how, what level you're willing to push your relationship with it. Like I said, I've played with weather in my teens when, you know, didn't really think necessarily about consequences as much, and have manifested or conjured tornadoes in the middle of Birmingham that have jumped to streets and then disappeared. Like, there is ways of those things happening that you need to understand the implications of that. Weather is big, so you know, you can play with it on a small scale with wind, etc. When you're starting to push into storm realms, you know, the sizable weathers, there is going to be particular risk with that. So, you know, bringing weather from one area and just pulling it across with no thought about how it happens, you may might get the rain that you want. If the land is actually already too dry, then you've got a flash flood on your hands. So, you know, you do have to think about how you're manipulating it. If you're going to go down that route. If you're doing what Michelle's talking about and bottling the energy itself in order to use it as an ingredient, then there's you know, very little risk that can go with that, because you're just using the essence like you would be if you were using rosemary or sage or any of the paprika or cayenne pepper. Like, they're ingredients. When you're using them in ingredient stage, then there's relatively no risk. you know, you'll either have a good or a bad spell, you know, and a well executed or a not so well executed spell. When it comes to manipulation of weather, you have to be aware of the consequences of that movement. So you know, it's a big one. I've got a couple more. For Eldrith says, I was just going to ask, what is the most bizarre experience that comes to mind? The bizarrest one would be the tornado thing. Obviously, me being me was kind of just playing with energy, manipulating energy in my teens, emotionally playing, then kind of go not actually thinking about the greater cause of it. So, you know, at that point, friends of mine that knew that that's what I did would often come and bring newspapers the next day and kind of go, was this you? Kind of situation, in order to, and then it started to have this recoil effect on me emotionally, kind of thinking, okay, having to think about the greater impact of playing with forces like that. So you have to consider the results of it. So, you know, with this particular, you know, you can probably Google it somewhere. This tornado kind of appeared out of nowhere, jumped down 2 streets, you know, smashed through one end of a house, and then evaporated. You know, that is pushing on the grounds of energies being in the right place and just given a push in order to make those things happen. So, you know, kind of jumping across a few, and then, you know, nobody was hurt. And that's, I suppose, that's the bit that always always sticks in my mind for me, is what danger or risk does a particular weather cause? You know, if you're just calling in, and I just say just, it's a big just calling in some extra rain or whatever. You know, consider that water is a long journey getting up into that atmosphere. Pulling it down on one particular space may be starving it from somewhere else. Or, you know, it's a big balance, weather systems. So, you know, considering it is a big part of what you need to be doing if you're going to go down the route of weather magic. Here we go. Mikhail, can bad weather, like no sun and no rain, either inhibit connections to spirit, and so makes any witchcraft practice harder? It depends. It depends on your system, and because obviously everyone's is slightly different. If there's a particular pantheon that you work with of spirits, I don't mean necessarily deities, I just mean kind of like, if you're one that works with local nature spirits, there is a balance to have with that relationship. So do be careful that you're not going to offend a particular spirit by bringing in another spirit from another. You know, hurricanes is a great example. There might be a group of spirits that have made that particular entity appear, or several spirits may have combined in order to make that hurricane exist at that point. So there is a delicate balance between that group of spirits that is working together at that time. So, you know, working with that group of spirits that's not from your area might offend the spirits that you locally work with. That depends on how you work with them. Me and Liam personally don't do any kind of devotee work. So, you know, we work with spirit on an equal footing, so that we don't petition from a point of devotion work, of worship. We work with them. It's a contract. So if you have that kind of relationship, you just got to consider what the contract terms are, and are you going to break or offend part of that contract by working with a different set of spirits? Asking because that seems to happen with me. Okay, it will always come down to power. Liam would love this bit, because it always comes down to power. You need to be able to exert your will upon an energy. So if it doesn't want to play, and you don't have the power in order to do it, it's not going to work. And what it comes down with this witchcraft practice being made harder by certain spirits is whether or not you are at an equal footing like you would like to be with a particular spirit, and are they the one that's providing your power. So if actually what you are using in your craft is more of something else's power rather than your own, then you're going to have issues that come around, power shortage and things like that when you're working spell work. But Michaela, if you want to join, like I say, join the Witchcraft Live, talk to the witches in there. It's a really good community to kind of bounce ideas around and problem shoot between witches that are doing similar things at a similar point in their magical career. And then obviously there is always the Patreon if you want to have one-to-one work with us. So there are all those considerations. Right, sorry, Helen, I am getting to you, sorry. I think I accidentally caused a weather change a few years ago. I was furiously angry and carrying out a spell, and the sky just erupted into a severe thunderstorm. There was also power cuts for hours. Is it possible to inadvertently affect the weather while carrying out a spell? Yes. You've got to remember that when you are doing spell work, you are raising energy and directing it. That is how most spell work works. You are raising energy. So if there happens to be the potential for a storm to already be there, so not that it was going to happen anyway, what I mean is all the ingredients that are required, all that it's needed at that point is a catalyst. You raising power and directing power is potentially the catalyst that is required for the storm to break. So yes, there are ways that when you are using and pulling energy, it would have depended on how you were pulling energy. So if you're the sort of person that pulls energy from your environment when you're creating spell work and isn't just using, because some people make the mistake of only ever using their own power. But I would imagine, Helen, that in the particular spell that you were working, you were pulling energy from around you and therefore affecting the immediate environment, i.e. the weather, that would have allowed that to trigger. So yes, there are always that risk when you're working with. It's like having an open chemistry set at all times. Sometimes you'll use ingredients that are like, oh, okay, well, I'll just use this ingredient, and that ingredient seems to have the power of a nuclear reactor and then explodes in your face. There is always that risk when you're practicing. There is no real safe practice of witchcraft because there are too many factors to consider. You can't spend your entire life trying to control every individual aspect of that. What you can do is get to know your ingredients well, and get to know your practice, and experiment well and regularly. When you see things go wrong, you learn more about the process than you would if you did spells right every time. So explore. Eldrith, yes, and or have a tribe to share and channel. Sweat Lodge is a purification ritual that also aligns your energy to each other. Yeah, so I personally don't work in kind of coven or tribe work. So yes, when you've got a situation where you have a coven arrangement, and there is a patron deity or a patron spirit or group of spirits that you regularly work with, you have to remember all those parts that make that up are a series of contracts. So yes, offending one of those particular spirits is going to have a negative effect on the spell casting you're capable of doing. So do actually think about how your arrangement works. Where does your energy come from? I'll often talk about the energy spell casting triangle and some of the other videos that we've done. That energy force that is used to power the craft that you are doing, or the spell or ritual that you are doing, is one of those three key ingredients of making spell work happen. and manifesting change, all those other words that you would use. So, you know, do consider all of that when you're doing or making changes to ritual, particularly when there are other people involved or other spirits involved, because you've got to consider what their feelings and thoughts about it will be. So, you know, you do have to balance the equation when you're making this spell work. Is there anything else or that anybody wants to ask before I go? Because I've been on an hour and I know I have a tendency to waffle. Liam hasn't jumped in, so I'm kind of hoping that means that this went fairly well and I answered most people's questions. Obviously, if there is a follow-up needed and you need me to do another one of these, because it is such a big subject, I'm hoping this has kind of given you a flavour of how weather magic works and the kind of things that you can do with it, some of the risks. If you need any particular specific parts, then obviously I can always do another video at another time, and hopefully I won't make you wait for 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks, or whatever it was from when I said I was going to do this for the next one. I've just changed jobs and it's been a busy time. Okay, I'm good. Okay, Michelle says she is happy. Hopefully she'll no doubt mention things in Witchcraft Live if she wants any particular parts of that to be expanded on. Anything else? Helen happy, and the rest of anyone else that's got anything else, and I'll go in a minute or so if nothing. Obviously, if you watch this at a later time, by all means, throw messages into the comments, and we'll do some other bits about that. Yes, Mikhail, it's one of my favourite types of work, and it's what why I'm known for bringing the sunshine to events that I want to go to, obviously, as opposed to the ones that I don't like. So yeah, so it's it really depends on what you want to know, and it looks like everyone is happy. So I'm gonna leave it there. Thanks for listening. Hopefully I've answered your questions. Any more, post them either in YouTube if that's where you are, or come over to Witchcraft Live and we'll have more discussions about weather magic in there. And like I said, I am more than happy, Mikhail, to do a follow-up if there's a particular part of weather magic that you want to know more about. All right, so we'll leave it there. Join us on Facebook and obviously join the Patreon. There is some really great content on there. Maybe I'll do a weather magic course on there at some point, or throw bits of it into other courses that we're doing. So, you really should get on there. All right, so I will speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.